Hello, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us here. I know we're running just a few minutes late here. I was trying to give everybody a little opportunity to sign on here and get in and get situated. But I don't want to hold everyone up, and certainly don't want to hold Dr. Moore up. And so, figure we'll go ahead and get started here. I wanted to, since some of you are already familiar with Founders and what we're trying to get going in Williamson and Sumner counties, I wanted to give you a little update. Also, since some of you are not familiar, I wanted to go ahead and give you a little bit of information on what we're trying to do and on the background of our organizations. My name is Brian Hawes. I'm the Vice President of Delray Education. We are a Tennessee-based nonprofit organization that was formed with the goal of launching Founders Classical Academies, classical charter schools. For those of you who are not familiar with a charter school, as opposed to a private school, which costs tuition, charter schools are approved by the local school district and are in effect public schools, although we're left to our own devices to pick curriculum and so forth. And so we're basically a privately operated public school. And so we're not necessarily subject to all of the requirements and all of the content that is being taught in public schools. However, we are free. And so a lot of parents who have been enrolled in classical schools, once a Founders comes into their area, they're usually very excited about it, as they can enroll their kids for free and not have to pay the tuition. So Delray Education, as I mentioned, we're a nonprofit made up of local residents in Williamson and Sumner counties, and we've actually got someone joining us, joining our board here in the near future from Blount County. And our goal is to launch a number of these Founders Classical Academies across the state of Tennessee over the next 10 years. We basically, Delray Education provides locally based representation and oversight, and the actual operator of the schools will be Responsive Ed. They are the largest charter school operator in Texas. They operate 90 charter schools across Texas and Arkansas, 21 of which are Founders Classical Academies. They have several other brands that they offer, which offer things like credit recovery for dropout prevention, or accelerated high school graduation. There's a virtual model, and so forth. And Responsive Ed's been in business for over 20 years now. They do about $230 million in annual revenues. They are also a nonprofit organization. They serve about 20,000 students with 3,000 employees. About 11 years ago, they started the Founders Classical Academy model. They actually started originally with the dropout recovery, and so many parents were so pleased with what they were able to do to help their kids get back on track and graduate high school that they came to Chuck Cook, Responsive Ed's CEO, and asked if it was possible for Responsive Ed to provide other K through 12 education to try and keep their children from getting into the situation where they're behind in credits and at risk of not graduating. And so that's how kind of how some of the other brands, including Founders brand, got started. Founders, they started the Founders brand in 2011. As I mentioned, they just opened their 21st school in Conroe, Texas this year, and are serving 14,000 students across Texas and Arkansas. And so we're partnering with them because they've got a tremendous amount of experience. They actually are consulted regularly by the state of Texas, the Texas Education Administration, when there are public schools that are struggling performance-wise academically. Often the TEA will bring Responsive Ed in to help turn around those schools and get them back on track. In fact, Responsive Ed has a whole division that is geared toward this. So just a tremendous organization. I've become familiar with them through my real estate business outside of education, but having seen what they're accomplishing for students across Texas, it's just kind of made my mind up that, hey, we need to partner with this organization and help get more of these schools out there and available to the public. And so anyway, so we started doing this in Tennessee, receiving some demand from parents, and particularly in Williamson County. There, a lot of parents are frustrated with the current curriculum that is being taught in public schools there in the district, and so we opened up or started this nonprofit to kind of oversee and provide some local representation there, and we're looking at bringing in responsive ed to operate the schools, bring in their expertise. We've got 2 charter applications that were submitted in February of this year, one in Williamson and one in Sumner County. The one in Williamson, we had hoped to get open in the fall of 2023. Sumner County, we had planned to open in 2024. The schools will hold about, well, they'll start off at K through 8, and then expand one grade per year after that until they finish up at K through 12. And then when they're fully built out, they'll house about 1,000 to 1,200 students. Where we're at right now, if any of you have been following the papers there, you know that our applications were initially rejected by the districts, and so we're now in the process of appealing to the state, to the Tennessee Department of Education's Appeals Commission. And we have our meetings coming up on the 20th and 21st. So we're hoping that many of you will come out. There's an opportunity for parents and local supporters to come out and express their support to the Appeals Commission to get founders opened in Williamson and Sumner. The Sumner meeting is on the 20th and at 1 p.m. I believe it is, and the Williamson hearing is on the 21st at 9 a.m. And you can get more details on that on our Facebook page. And if any of you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. You should have all received an email from me with my email address with the information to connect to this webinar. And so that's where we're at in terms of getting the schools open. We're still looking for locations to locate the school in Williamson and Sumner. We've got a couple of opportunities that we're exploring. So certainly if anybody has any information on somebody that local churches that would be interested in leasing out space or property, either something that's already built that could house a school, or we're actually looking at, we've got a 12-acre site of vacant land that we could look at. We'd have to probably plant something somewhere temporarily for the 23 school year, but we could probably get something built for the 24 school year. So anyway, so that's our update. As I said, anybody that has any other questions, feel free to reach out to me directly via my email address, and I'll be glad to get you more information. And if you'd like to attend the hearings next week, please reach out to me for that as well. So without further ado, I want to introduce kind of the academic genius behind the programs that we offer and that really set Founders Classical Academy and other classical charter schools apart. Dr. Terrence Moore. Dr. Moore former Marine and has his PhD in education, and specifically did his dissertation on the history of education in the 18th century, and specifically on influences on the founding of America. He got into and became a pioneer of actually classical charter schools when he became the founding principal of Ridgeview Classical Academy back in 2001. When he was there at Ridgeview, he developed the program that the majority of classical charter schools across the country currently use, and I believe even a lot of classical private schools use. It's made up of the core knowledge sequence supplemented with Singapore math and Riggs reading. Dr. Moore's and the school received recognition as one of the top schools in Colorado. I believe it was in their second year of existence. And then also went on to receive national recognition from U.S. News and several other national outlets for the performance of Ridgeview Classical. Dr. Moore was subsequently hired by Hillsdale College to implement this same core knowledge, Singapore math, and RIGS program for their Barney Charter School initiative, which you've probably heard Governor Lee talk about, also introducing into Tennessee. He subsequently helped launch Atlanta Classical Academy, and was involved for quite a period of time with the Sept Classical Academy. It's a very successful group of schools out of Colorado. And he's now become the executive director of classical academics for Founders Classical Academies, and we're very glad to have him. And so with that, I will leave it to you, Dr. Moore.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Haas. And I'm glad to be able to talk to you all this evening, albeit remotely. So I can't see folks. Normally, I like to have a lot of interaction and you might call it Socratic discussion. So I can't do that so well, though I do hope that at the end we'll have time for questions. But I do want to take into account some of the things that I think you might be asking, and really present to you what a classical education looks like, specifically in this charter public school setting Mr. Haas described, and also what I would call an American classical education, which is one whose purpose is to make good citizens who will also be our leaders of tomorrow. And I don't know the extent to which you all have encountered the idea of classical education before. There are a lot of people in the country who have, including a lot who've encountered it through homeschooling, which is where it was first, I think, reignited in the late 90s. And there are different ways within the same house, you might say, of talking about classical education. And I wanted to tell you what seems to be distinct about ours that we contemplate here at Founders. But the first thing I'd like to say is that we don't need to make it overly complex, and sometimes that does happen. If you were to ask, and I don't know, I can't see y'all, so I don't know what age y'all are, but if you were to ask my grandparents' generation what a classical education was, they would look at you as though you were pretty strange. And then if you did what I did as a kid, which is asked to see their textbooks, and you took them out and started looking at them, you would say, wait a minute, this is a classical education. These are complete works of literature. Here's a really thick grammar book that you're supposed to learn. Here's poetry that you're memorizing. Don't you know what a classical education is, Grandma, Grandpa? And they would, and I'm from East Texas mainly, they look at me and say, well, I know. That's called going to school. And that's basically what it was. In this country, the education that was set up even before the founding fathers, whose purpose was largely to make sure children could read, and specifically read the Bible, but read a lot more besides, all the way through the founding generation, where you had this generation of leaders who wanted to make sure that after sweating and risking their lives on setting up a country devoted to liberty, that it wouldn't be lost in a generation or two, as it had been in so many countries before, all the way through the trials of the Civil War and westward expansion, and through the early part of the 20th century in some really tough times, to include 2 world wars. The idea was this education held fast, and it taught us what we ought to be and what we can be in every way, using reason, using the imagination, using the human memory. It was just simply going to school. And then you might say in the middle of the 20th century, but a little bit even before that, with some ideas that were floating around, to include, unfortunately, ideas at my alma mater for college. The idea that we don't really have to study the past, that we don't need traditional learning, that we can let kids just kind of find their way on their own, became extremely popular, combined with the idea that let's just train them for a job. Let's forget this citizenship stuff. That's really for the leaders to decide, not the common people. And so, although what gets called progressive education very often marches under the banner of a small d democratic education, it's really not. because what our founders thought is that if we're going to give all citizens the vote, we have to make their minds and their hearts equal to that responsibility. And so really, a classical education should not be for a limited upper crust, as it was for so many years in Europe and in England as well. I do realize what happened today in English history, and our hearts go out to that wonderful woman and queen. But we need to understand that we've inherited that great British and classical inheritance. At the same time, we've made it something that every American citizen can live up to and is their responsibility. So what is that? Let's go into the details a little bit so that you might know what that would look like. And then we might ask the question, well, why do we need this old stuff in modern times? Because here we are on a Zoom. I'm sorry, it's not a Zoom. It's a WebEx, which I'd never encountered before until about 45 minutes ago. But it's one of these ways of communicating via a screen. Doesn't that mean we can throw out the old stuff because, you know, Apple's unveiling its new iPhone just the other day? Well, let's talk about it, right? First of all, we have to ask the question, who are human beings? And it shouldn't take Aristotle to tell us, though he did, is that human beings are most distinct for the fact that they talk to each other. They have language. Now, maybe the birds and the bees, they have a way of talking to each other that we don't understand. I know dogs bark at each other, but human beings live by conversation, live by speech, live by communication. So doesn't it stand to reason that if that's the case, we need to spend a lot of time teaching young people the arts of communication, the arts of language? Now, if we're going to do that and we're going to do it well, what is that going to look like? I'll give you a hint. What's this? By the way, on my screen, this is backwards. Does this look okay, Mr. Haas? Okay, so everything, see, looks backwards on the screen. At any rate, what is this? Well, it's a letter, obviously. It's the letter A, the first one that children likely learn when they learn their alphabet. How important is learning the letter A, and how important is it to get it right? Well, this is the funny thing. We know we have to have the alphabet, because without the alphabet, we can't have words, and without words, we can't have communication. The question we should ask ourselves is, are we doing justice to the alphabet? Are we teaching it the right way? Now, I'm guessing, and I'm not able to ask you all this, but I know what I was taught is that the letter A makes two sounds, long A and short A, and A, right? What happens when you get to a word like father, in which the A is saying ah? And what happens in typical schools is they'll say, well, that's an exception. They're not pronouncing it the right way, so we'll put that up on our word wall, and we'll call it an outlaw word because the A is not being pronounced the right way. Now think about calling your father an outlaw. That's the first problem. The second problem is we're not doing justice to A, because in fact the letter A has at least three sounds, a, and ah. Now, you may not know this, but there's a huge debate in the phonics community about whether there's a fourth sound of A, which would be aw. So the third sound we hear in A, in father, ah. Where I come from, I call my daddy Paul. And so when I want to walk the walk or talk the talk, I hear that fourth sound of A. Y'all can't hear that in Ohio? Too bad. Point is, if we can't get the letter A right, folks, how are we going to get anything right? And so obviously what we do in a classical school is we begin with the foundation of language, is we teach the letters of the alphabet and their operations in words in which we don't have to make them outlaws. We tell them what they really do. You probably know this as phonics. The old word for it is orthography, which literally means straight writing. So we examine the spelling of words and interpret that and explain it to young people so that they, from the very beginning, get a command over their language, starting with the spelling of it. What's going on in the world, right? And especially what's going on in the world of the screen, the world of technology. Well, who's heard of this thing called spell check, right? I don't know how to turn off spell check on my machine. That's how badly technological I'm afflicted technologically. But what I know is it makes these funny red lines under any word that it thinks you've misspelled. Now, some folks who like to quote French and Latin and whatnot are constantly wrestling with their spell check because it's sometimes it'll even change words on you that you didn't expect. But my point is this: if our spelling needs the crutch called spell check and we can't spell otherwise, we have lost power in our own language. And if we are, like Aristotle said, creatures of language, and we don't even know how to spell the words, that's like going out for the football team and not knowing what a forward pass is. You can't play the game, right? So that's the spelling part. Guess what? In a classical school, we're going to spend a lot of time on that. And it's going to be from kindergarten on up to at least fourth grade, probably close to an hour or more a day, so that when these kids get out into the world, they can not only read, but they can write, they can spell properly, and very often they can explain why words are spelled the way that they are. And it has a lot to do with other foreign languages that get imported into our language. Does that make sense? I hope. Again, I'm not able to see y'all, so I hope you're kind of cheering or saying this is good. We got to do more with words, though, right? This is called a dictionary, and I'm not trying to insult your intelligence. It's not the best word for a dictionary, actually. In German, they call it a Wörterbuch, which means word book, which the Germans are very explicit. Mr. Haas would appreciate that from his background. But what it is a valuable resource that has a long history in the English language with Samuel Johnson and other great pillars of understanding words, putting this together so that we can become, again, champions of words. Why is that important? Well, it's important to know words in order to be able to use them. And this, again, may seem like the most obvious thing in the world, but I will say that nowadays, having spent a lot of time teaching at the high school level, at the elementary level, at the middle school level, and at the college level, a lot of folks' vocabularies these days are, you might say, attenuated. That means not as robust as they should be. If we don't have words and an understanding of words, of their meanings, of their origins, of their connotations, that is how they sound is when they come across, then again, we're going into the fight without any weapons. Because working in the world means working with words. Anything that you say, whether it be to your fiance, whether it be to your boss, whether it be to your employees, whether it be to a team, if you're the coach, you're going to be using words. And if you want to see that historically, think about Winston Churchill and his command over the Allies as he was saving Western civilization. He was somebody who wasn't very good at Latin. That's the part that made him naughty. But he had a command over English as no one else of his century did, or very few people who weren't professors or writers. And what did he do with that command over language? He inspired a people, and in fact, several peoples, to defend themselves against tyrants. Had he been any less adept at words, maybe he couldn't have pulled it off, right? We know when we are inspired. We know that not just through ordinary words, but through music. When words are set to a rhyme and then set to a particular tone, and I'm told that y'all know about music up there in Nashville. I don't know. Oh, that's right. That's right. I grew up listening to both kinds of music, country and Western. And so you know what a great poem sounds like when it's set to music and how it inspires and often sympathizes with the heart. If we want our children to have heart, to have heads that think, that have the power of words so that they can convey their feelings about what they know is right, if we don't give them the tools to do that, which would be the command of words, then again, we're selling them short. We're not giving them what they need. It's like Never practicing hitting if you want to be a baseball player. How many hours do you have to spend in a batting cage or with your little brother throwing what he thinks are fastballs to you to be the batter that you ought to be? Well, the same is true of words, folks. And so we spend a lot of time on language in a classical school, and you might say that it's based in language. So, what else? Speaking of language, this is a book that I got in college. It's called Mathematics for the Non-Mathematician. When I first saw this title, I laughed. That was pretty much me and summed me up. And in fact, I had a very famous, well-known mathematician who gave me this in the class. I think he had a bet with his colleagues about whether you could teach poets how to do calculus. But at any rate, where does math fit in a classical school? Here's the interesting thing about math. We think of it as numbers, and we think of it through this little vehicle here called a calculator. And we think of it as just quantities and problems that we got to solve so that we can get a good grade and we're done. It's not what math is. Math is, I've been told this by professional mathematicians, math is a language without which we cannot survive. And if you think about even some of the words that we use in the English language, such as both, none, many, several, there's an implicit mathematics in everything that we do. If we know we have an appointment at a certain time of day, we're using mathematics. We know that there are certain dates in our calendar that mean something, like the 25th of December, or every accountant's favorite day, the 15th of April. These numbers mean something to us. We have to give students the ability to manipulate and to understand numbers so that they live in a world that they're in touch with. Now, this may seem like the biggest ounce of common sense that you've ever come across, but here's what I find, again, increasingly in this modern world that's disturbing. And that is, I go into, let's say, coffee shop of some kind, Starbucks, Dunkin', what have you, and I'm carrying cash for whatever reason. And so I give a certain amount of cash to the cashier, and then I want an even dollar back, and it's, $3.67 or something like that. And the person, when I give that amount of change, let's say $4.67, looks at me as though I'm insane and doesn't know what to do. Now, how many of you have had that encounter where you're doing a simple mathematical operation that used to be easy when you rolled pennies, when you did all those things as a kid, that adults these days cannot do? That's a problem. Because it's great to be able to scan your credit card, and now there's a fist bump kind of credit card that people keep telling me, what do you call it, to bounce your credit card? There's a different name for it, to knock it. I forgot, Mr. Haas. What do they want me to do with my credit card? You used to slide it, and then you stuck it in, and now you just high five with your credit card. At any rate, whatever. The point is, if you don't know the numbers behind the operation that you're performing, you don't know what's going on with your own money. And if we actually have people who are working behind the cash register who can't do what we would call mental math, that means there is a break in understanding of between them and the way the world works. And not just of money, but of everything, right? And that's a problem, because everything we do has a numerical element to it. If you get on the highway tomorrow morning to go to work or somewhere, you're going to pass by mile markers. You're probably going to get on an interstate that has a certain number to it, and it's there for a reason. It's a code. But we are not teaching mental math to young people, and therefore they don't know what's going on mathematically. That doesn't bode well for our future. So, by the way, I just saw Top Gun, the new one, Maverick. And if you think about the amount of mathematics that goes on in the flight of those planes, it's astonishing, right? Behind planes that are made to defend our country. but we have to know what that mathematics is behind jet propulsion, or again, it's just a stab in the dark. At any rate, let me continue with some of the other things that you would get in a classical school. Latin. Now, you wouldn't start this in grade 1 necessarily, but you would start it pretty early on. Maybe some Latin and Greek roots by the 3rd and 4th grade, or even earlier. And by the 6th grade, maybe even the 5th, they would start formal Latin. Again, as counterculture as you can imagine, why would you be studying this dead language? But I ask you this question: how dead is it? If you see the words etc., or if you see the words et alia, or if you see id est, i.e., or e.g., these little things that we have all these abbreviations that we used to write with, where do they come from? They come from Latin. What if we encounter a word such as classical? That's our big question right now. What is a classical education? Why should my kids go to a classical school? What is classical? What does it mean? Well, if we look in our Latin books, in our Latin dictionaries, we find out something pretty interesting. Number one, when you hear the word classical, what do you think? And here I'm going to have to play one of my sons, who's 10 or 11 right now. And what he would say in his own words is, dude, that's a classic. And he uses that vocabulary, so it's out there, as you probably know. Or he would say, dude, that's epic. Now, when I was growing up, the word epic was not used in the vernacular. So I'm thinking this is another sign of a comeback, okay? Dude, it's epic. Dude, it's classic. What does it mean? The word classic, when we think of it, is we think of classical music, or classic music, as in classic rock, or classic country, which, by the way, there's a shortage of these days. And don't get me on that tangent, because I'm not happy with what you can find out there. But that's a different story. And for a long time, there's been classic rock, classic cars, 57 Mustang, 65 Chevy Camaro. What makes them classic? What it means, what it implies is it's timeless and it's the best. So when we use the word classical or classic, what we're actually saying is this is a standard here that the world will always recognize. And therefore, we need to keep that standard in front of, in full view of, the minds and hearts of our young people. But there's another trick to it. If you have a Latin dictionary, or you may Google it, look up the word classicum, where classic comes from. You know what it actually means? Originally, it's a trumpet. Now, why would Romans be playing a trumpet? Were they part of the pre-jazz age? No, when you hear a trumpet in Roman times, it's called a battle. And so the classicum is what calls out all the troops, which is basically every man in Rome. And then they're arranged according to classes, which gives you another meaning of the definition classic, which is the classicum is also referring to the military, specifically to the Navy, and even more specifically to those aboard ships who then conduct an amphibious assault. We would call that the United States Marine Corps, the most classical organization in the country, but that's a different tangent I'll get off on as well. The point is, the classicum is not some dead thing over there that we need to forget about. Classic is a call to action. It's a call to emulate, it's a call to preserve, it's a call to protect. And if we're not hearing that call, we're not paying attention. So you can get a lot by just opening up a Latin dictionary and letting your eyes fall on certain words. And what's interesting is you'll know more about the words that you use, or perhaps use blithely, as I do every day, but without examining them. And as we know, words mean things. Just ask two young lovers whether they hear what they want to hear when they're talking to each other, because when they don't, things go badly. I've been watching a lot of Leave It to Beaver lately too, and it's interesting how the words that they use, more antiquated 60s version than we do, how important it is that you get the right words across, or otherwise one of those teachers might get pretty mad at you. What else? Well, obviously we're going to study history. And this is what is, at least early on when I was younger, is dearest to my heart. What do we do when we're actually studying history? We're studying our heritage. We're studying our inheritance. We're studying the world that's been given to us. And like all inheritances, it's a mixed bag. A lot of work has been done to give us the liberty that we have, to give us the justice that we have. But when any torch is passed, there's still more work to be done. So knowing what our history actually is means knowing who we are, where we've come from, what our successes have been, our great triumphs, and what have been our losses, what have been our mistakes. And so a thoughtful and just examination of the past is really what introduces us to human affairs. And we understand who human beings are, what they strive for, when they're at their best, and when they're at their not best. That's what we do with history. And we do, in a school like this, I think, take a patriotic side. Patria means your fatherland, again, Latin. And just as we loved our grandfathers, and if we knew them, our great-grandfathers, we want to carry on what their work was. It's not to say that they were perfect, but it is to say we owe them a lot. And they have probably a lot to teach us. So we need to listen to them and to understand that history as best we can. And when I say history here, I don't mean kind of a social studies sitting around the table. Oh, we got to write a constitution. How would you write a constitution? I mean, starting in kindergarten and first grade and second grade, actually starting to learn many of the great events of the past, both in the ancient past and in our more modern national past. And I'll speak to that in a minute to give some more specifics. Literature. Again, you would expect that in a classical school. You would expect that in any school, but what does that mean? And do we nowadays even know how to study literature? And I think that's a big question, because what I know is by my first year of college, is that when I got there, even though I'd been a good student in high school, I had no idea how to read a book. I knew what the words were. I knew what these little plot diagrams were that my teachers had taught me about rising action and climax and falling action and all that stuff, but I didn't know how to go into a story and live it. And that's what we do with literature. We live it, because these stories are great. The ones that we read, these classic stories, are about all kinds of human beings and all manifestations, whether through war or love or sacrifice. But to do them justice, we have to get in there and read those stories like they were real. And I could explain that in more detail if I had a book in front of me, but whether it be an adventure and a lot of humor with somebody like Tom Sawyer, or if it's a tougher road with somebody like Scout Finch, who sees her father act heroically and then sees him essentially abandoned by his neighbors, and a certain color of man suffer as a result. Whatever we're reading, we need to give it our true sympathy and understanding as though it were real, and get rid of the plot diagrams and live these stories. Because when we do that, what we're doing is opening up not only young people's minds, but we're opening up their hearts so that they understand really what humanity is in its possibilities and in its flaws. And the more of literature that you read, the more you'll understand about humanity and, frankly, about yourself. And it's fun, too. There are great moments in literature that need to be recreated and relived in every generation. And that starts with childhood poetry like this, or in something meatier like this, Pride and Prejudice. And again, I'm not the only one who thinks this, but folks these days, including older folks, aren't always doing the best thing when it comes to men and women and how they relate to each other. We want to try to prepare our young people for what's out there. And so what I basically always tell, especially young women who are in 9th or 10th grade, if a fella asks you out, you hand him a copy of Pride and Prejudice and you say, read this and then get back to me. Because every man out there, to include Mr. Darcy, needs a bit of improvement before he's worthy of that lady's hand. And you won't get that just through a rule book, and you won't get it through modern culture. Jane Austen has something to say. So this is what I mean. And what the surprising thing is, because I've taught Jane Austen, I've taught it to high school students, and at the end of that book, even the boys in the class who didn't take to it at first, it moves them. It moves their hearts, and it makes them understand themselves and what love is sung in so many songs better than they had and better than they could in any other way other than the tough lot of experience. So that's what literature is. Poetry, by the way, is something that is singularly lacking these days, I think, in schools, sometimes even in classical schools. And if you look at the great poets of old, E. Cummings, Robert Louis Stevenson, Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson, the great writers were writing poetry half the time, even when they were writing novels and plays. And that's lost on us, and that's a problem. Because I think what poetry is basically the muse speaking to us in ways in which the words work together so tightly that they're memorable and that they reflect on each other, and that we can own by memorizing them throughout our lives. And they become, you might say, the book of our hearts. And so the fact that kids don't memorize poetry anymore in schools usually, I think is not only an aesthetic or literary problem, I think it's a moral problem. And what we do in the school is we have young people, starting with the early kind of kids' poems, memorizing poems, and more up through high school, so that when they get out into the world, they will own some of the greatest thoughts and greatest phrases ever put into the English language. So you might say that there's a poetry comeback in the making. We talked about math. What about science? Do we have any place for science in classical school? The answer to that is absolutely. In fact, I would say that we have even more place for science in a classical school, because we get behind the history and the real theory of science, and we're not just doing labs or trying to balance equations. We're going to the why behind the science as well. And this starts in the early grades. So it starts with chemistry as early as the 2nd grade. And in the 5th grade, believe it or not, they will memorize most of the table of elements in chemistry. And it's amazing to see 5th graders rattling off these different elements that most of us didn't learn until we were in 10th grade, where it just seemed like a block of stones falling on us when our teacher said, here, you got to memorize this to know chemistry. But in the 2nd, in the 5th, again, in the 7th grade, they will learn big doses of chemistry, so that when they get into the high school, they've already got the building blocks of what chemistry is. And they'll be able to do more with it at those higher levels. And we could spend a little time talking about what goes on in science, but I assure you that there's every amount of effort that can be made in order to get very good science teachers, which are not the easiest folks to find these days, and to put them in the classroom working on the physical environment and the way the world works from that perspective, as much as in any other way. And this is important because you wouldn't think that, for example, physics has anything to do with philosophy. That's kind of the way that I grew up. I will tell you that without Isaac Newton, I don't think you have the founding fathers, because there was an idea of a universe and the way the world worked behind this historical event that we would call the Enlightenment, that informed the way the founding fathers thought about the operations of government and how you form this balanced universe that is still friendly to human beings. So at any rate, we could say a little bit about that. And finally, the arts. Well, not finally, we have a couple more things to talk about, but the arts, again, should be vibrant in a classical school. And I think what happens in a lot of schools these days is the kids who think they're good at art, they get to take art. It's an elective, nobody else cares about it. And we never, as a class, as whole groups of young people, to include when they're very young, work our way up through art so that we can understand the beauties of music and the beauties of physical art, which again are a statement about humanity and are meant to lift us up or at least explain who we are as human beings. And so that's what art does. And again, anecdotally, first time I remember going to an art museum is when I got to Chicago, going to college, and I went to the Art Institute, and I just sat in front of these pictures for a while and looked at them and said, "Oh, that's art." We can do better than that, folks. And what's really great is to see a group of young people, to include in the fourth or fifth grade, look at a really stately piece of art, a famous one, and have opinions about it and be able to discuss it in the same way they'd be able to, discuss a ball game or something, because they really understand what's behind it. And so we inculcate that very same aesthetic into them in the same way that we inculcate all this learning that we know is headed toward philosophy and these refined things. So that's a little bit about what you would call the curriculum, though the one thing that we haven't mentioned is, what about our physical presence? What about our education of the human body? And that is important too. And it's also really a good thing to get the wigglies out. So there will be gym, there will be sports, there will be extracurricular activities, because it was the philosopher John Locke who said the obvious, which is a sound mind and a sound body is that which most people would describe as a good education. And so we want that to develop as well. And as I say, we want them to go out there during recess, burn some energy. And oh, by the way, we will play dodgeball, which in my school was called war ball, which on some campuses is not allowed anymore because, I don't know, you're not supposed to throw balls at each other. But what's the point of being a boy if you can't knock somebody in the head with a sort of soft Nerf ball wrapped in a really strong tape? At any rate, that's a little bit about the curriculum, and I've gone on maybe a little too long, but I want to say this: all of this, in addition to the decorum and the setup of the school, is meant to do another important thing besides inform these young people's heads, and that is to inform their hearts. And so a lot of time is spent on the education for character. And that means in setting up the right decorum of the school, the right order of the school, but it also means in a lot of the lessons that they learn, whether through history or literature, they do have a very strong moral component. And we're trying to show young people this, not so we can just shake our fingers at them and say, "Stop doing that, kid," which you do have to do, of course, but so that we can show them the good, the strength, the virtues that are in young people, and how pursuing those virtues actively is what really sets up their opportunity for achieving a good and happy life. And I think you would agree with me that what we want as parents is our children ultimately to be happy and to live a life that makes them happy. And that almost always means doing what's right and doing what's good. What in your heart, is calling you, that your heart is the real classicum, the real trumpet that's saying, here is how you do good in the world, and here is how you make yourself happy. And it's a long journey, and it's not necessarily an easy journey, but it is one in which young people need help, and this is the help that we can give them. So if you think about all this together, how can we do this? Well, back to my idea, or not my idea, but back to the idea of a classical education, we're aiming for the best. To do it, we have to have the best books, the best curriculum, we would call it overall. We have to have the best teachers who are worthy of those books. And then we have to invite and to pull out the best out of young people. And so it's like a triangle. We The easy part, that's knowing what the books are, right? Here they are. You don't have to see the exact titles, but we know students need to read um, some Homer. They need to hear about how those Greeks fought each other. They need to hear about how Odysseus got home and how his son helped him, Telemachus. Um, we know that they need to learn something about medieval chivalry. This is my little obviously this was a kid's Halloween costume or something, one of my sons. This could have been converted in other ways for other purposes too. But the point is here, in our schools, chivalry is not and should not be dead. And the way to make sure that it's not dead, that form of politesse, of manners, of politeness, is that we teach them what knights in the Middle Ages did. And we teach them through one of the great authors, among others, Sir Walter Scott, through Ivanhoe. That's one of the books that I found in my grandfather's closet. And I thought, why wasn't I reading this? And we do that, we make that come alive. And so we send out young people into the world as knights, not as Don Quixotes, who think that everything's passed us by and we're fighting windmills. Rather, we're sending them into a world where they can engage morally with it and improve a society that may have lost its sight about what true manners really are. So this is what we're trying to do in a nutshell. And so working on character as much as we're also working on what goes into the minds of young people is very important. And trust me, young people are relieved when they're told what the good is, because deep down, I think that's what they want. And there's a lot of confusion in this world about what it is. And so when they can see examples that actually appeal to their hearts, the better off they are. And there'll be lots of components of the school itself that will lend itself to that, such as starting the day off with reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, and likely then reciting the school pledge, which might be something to the effect of, I will learn the good, I will learn the true, I will do the good, and I will love the beautiful, which is a kind of commitment in their hearts to living their lives in this way, in which they can be worthy of those great books. So what do we have to have? Those great teachers to pull that off. And nationwide, there's a teacher shortage out there. In terms of finding these teachers who can pull this off, who are themselves classically trained or at least wanted to be, and want to teach in this way, there's an even bigger shortage. But at the same time, there are a lot of teachers who really want that. And there are more and more young people who have been trained classically who want to get back into that life and return the favor, or who are inspired in that way. There are a lot of teachers in the regular system who have seen its flaws, particularly during COVID and other things when really the classroom has come under examination. And this is what they want, and they just need the training to be able to do it. And that's something that we can do. And then the final component to get the best out of our young people, that's what we were just talking about. When we show them how to be knights and ladies, they love it, they appreciate it, they live it. And that's what we have to live and believe to make good citizens and good human beings. So we're right at the top of the hour. I can't tell if y'all are shaking your heads yes, or y'all are looking at me like I'm some kind of strange person from another universe. But at any rate, I'd like to get some questions on the floor, explain some things that maybe I haven't already, or take up specifics if you would like. So again, thanks for joining us in this format. Mr. Haas, did you want to kind of take it?
So, and forgive my lack of familiarity here. I'm actually new to this as well, but you should be able to. There should be a Q&A panel down in the bottom of your screen there, and so if you want to just click on that, and you should be able to type in a question. I don't see any way to just enable the attendees to just let y'all talk.
Or if you want, I can go on and do some other specifics. It's up to y'all. But if there are any questions, I want to give folks a chance to ask.
Yeah, I thought I saw a couple of hands go up there. Let's see what, oh, here we go. Okay, one said that we're emphatically nodding our heads yes to everything you've said. So,
Okay, that's good.
someone else said, thank you, Dr. Moore, for all that you do. Okay, here we have a question. So the question is the classroom set up in a Socratic manner? So if you want to talk a little bit about how the classroom is
Okay, so that's a really great question. So the one way that it's not set up mostly, uh, which is the way that it's done in other schools and has been for a while, is in this pod system where you have all these kids in separate little islands looking at each other. That may happen in art. It may happen if you're doing a science lab. There are times in which that will happen. It could happen if you were doing a legitimate discussion in teams and you wanted them, all writing the perfect essay, provided they'd been trained in the right way. But that is not the standard way of sitting. The standard way of sitting, especially K through 6, 7, is just like you would see it if you walked into one of Laurel Ingalls Wilder schools, with the desks facing the front, the teacher at the front of the class with, used to be a chalkboard, now it would be a whiteboard back here like this, writing on the board and emphatically instructing students. That's the way of the past. And what that implies, just that setup, is that the teacher knows something, knows the subject that he or she is teaching, and is conveying that to young people, and is therefore the medium between knowledge and the child's mind. There's another reason that you may not know, but in the old days, they used to bolt down the desks into the floor itself. And you may think, well, that is very rigid. But if you've ever been a teacher in one of these schools, you know the phenomenon of desk creep, which is kids throughout the day push their desks up. And so by the end of the day, sometimes you're almost trapped against the whiteboard. So once again, folks in the old days knew what they were doing, more so than we do. Now, as far as the Socratic setup, which is when would we ever take a class and have them sit in a rectangle or a square in which you would have the teacher maybe still with a whiteboard behind her, but sitting as just one of the participants, presumably just asking questions, and then the students get into the firing line and they get to answer the questions. That too can happen with this caveat. We don't want the discussion just to roll off the road in directions that can't be supported by the text. So the teacher does have a primary responsibility. And then the second thing is to get students to that point where they can have that kind of discussion is going to take a lot of work. And that's mainly something that's going to happen in the upper school, starting 7th, 8th grade. And then it's mainly going to be with a subject that lends itself to that, which is the obvious one, is literature. And the reason you can do it with literature is because the story is already between the two covers, right? Whereas with history, that's very hard to do because the kids don't know the history yet. Until they know the story, they can't have that discussion. They won't know the story until the teacher has taught them the story. And no history book's going to work. The history books from the greatest historians like Samuel Eliot Morison to the not so great ones are kind of boring for kids. So the teacher is going to have to make the event come alive in their minds before they can have the discussion. So, and I've taught a lot of history, and the way that I like to do it where it does become more Socratic is either at the beginning of a lesson, you can ask the question that tees it up, or at the end of a particular event that you've studied where you can actually have a debate. And I like to do that, have what I call the Friday debates, or like the old Friday night fights, where half the room thinks this and half the room thinks that, and then we go at it. And it's amazing how when you do that, students will take ownership of the discussion and they love it, but they have to be prepared to be able to do that. So the short answer to that is, contrary to what a lot of schools out there these days think, when they say that the teachers ought to be the guide on the side and not the sage on the stage, we say teachers have to be the sage on the stage. One, because a sage is a very wise person, and I would hope that teachers are that. And two, you are on the stage as a teacher. You are presenting, and it has to be, in some sense, theatrical to be able to come across to students so that they understand the full measure of an historical event or a work of literature. And just the last thing I'll say is think about Shakespeare, or think about any of the Greek playwrights or Roman playwrights. People first encountered them as people going to a theatrical presentation. They got to see the sword fight. They got to see the speeches of Cicero. They got to see Cicero being, what am I saying? Caesar being stabbed, right? Et tu, Brute. That meant something because they saw it. So teachers have to be good at reenacting that and resetting that stage to make the lesson come alive in the minds and hearts of the young folks. Long answer, short question, but I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd like to add a little piece to that too. Having been witness to this, been witness to some of the classrooms, been on several tours of founders and other classical schools using this the same program, and it's really remarkable seeing kids in the third grade, with the teacher, and they haven't necessarily rearranged the desks, but they're having a discussion in class with the teacher about the virtues of Robin Hood and Little John, and when are laws just or unjust. They're having debate with the teacher about some of the virtues of Tom Sawyer and the things that he goes through for Becky Thatcher to win her affections. And it's really quite remarkable to see these young kids, grasping and embracing this knowledge and speaking so adeptly to it. So, all right, let me pull up the questions here. Somebody asked, is the session being recorded? Yes, this is being recorded, and we are going to release it. I'll send out the link to everyone once it's available. Next question is, what started you on the path to pushing for this curriculum?
That's a question for me.
I guess I can answer it from the Delray education standpoint. My interest in this, and not having children myself, and actually being a high school dropout, when I saw the remarkable education that was going on in these founder schools, not only from an academic standpoint, and I'll just give you a little example of that we're actually using in our presentation for the state commission next week or in 2 weeks. But it just came out in the Tennessean not too long ago that Williamson County, this is regarded as the highest performing county in the state, is just getting back to its pre-COVID numbers of students who are performing at or above grade level in English language arts and math. And they're about 67% are at or above grade level in ELA, and about 69% are at or above grade level in math. To look at a similar Founders Classical Academy in a similar district with of similar demographics would be Frisco, Texas. 92% of students are at or above grade level in English language arts, and 94% are at or above grade level in math. So the academics are outstanding, and it's a level of learning that it's difficult to put your finger on. There's a depth, as I was just describing, the kids, debating the virtues of just and unjust laws. There's a depth of understanding that goes on. I've toured a number of other schools, looking at, at what those students are learning, and then they're learning. I know it's kind of become cliche about they're learning to pass the test. They're being taught to the test. that is often the case, but there's certainly not a depth of understanding that's going on with those students at the same grade levels as there are in these classrooms. And of course, for me personally, in going after classical education and wanting to expand it nationwide, um, it's important to saving our republic. And seeing the things that are taught, the value of the academics, as Dr. Moore mentioned in the beginning of his talk, about students just being prepared to function in the world. But then with the history component, particularly the American history, and he hasn't gotten into it yet, well, from very early on, they start learning the Declaration of Independence. They start learning the Constitution. By the time they're, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Dr. Moore, I would say the end of the fourth grade, they're able to recite the first 248 words of the Declaration. And they spend, what, an entire semester, I believe it is, in the ninth grade on the Constitution. And so these students are graduating not only having an outstanding academic education and are prepared not just to go out and become good workers, but are prepared to pursue any career um, or job that they deem appropriate throughout the course of their life. But they're also prepared to be future leaders, be it in their local community, all the way up to the federal level of this country, and are prepared to do so with ethics and integrity and courage that is seldom found today. Um, so that was my reasoning behind wanting to have this curriculum and wanting to pursue and expand classical education. Dr. Moore, you want to add to that?
Well, yes, this is something that I've been wanting to do for a long time, and as I had suggested earlier, I think it really came to me first when I realized how shortchanged I was being in my own education, because I was a good student and for the most part wanted to do well in school, but I don't know that I was challenged. At the same time, I loved reading about politics. And when I was young, I watched Crossfire when it first came on. Um, y'all may remember that. And but what really happened when I was in high school is the Reagan administration's A Nation at Risk report came out, which said that um, what had been done to our schools, had it been done to us by a foreign country, would be considered an act of war. As it is, we did it to ourselves. And I remember reading that, and I remember seeing that in my own high school, in which I frankly was not challenged, with the exception of a couple of teachers, and one in particular who was my American history teacher. And I remember him in his response when that um, the Nation at Risk report came out, and he just basically shook his head and said, "Yep, that's the world that we're in." And so I could see the difference between what education had been when he had started teaching as early as the early 60s and what it had become in the way of some of my other classes. Not that my teachers weren't nice people and wanted the best, they just hadn't been trained. And they themselves had not had that kind of education, so they didn't know what really to do in the classroom. And so that really put a fire in me that made me want to change things. And I obviously went to university and went to the toughest one with the most commitment to the great books that of any out there, and that fired me up even more. And if that wasn't enough, I had Alan Bloom as a professor at a time when both E.D. Hirsch and Alan Bloom, who became rivals, which I've always regretted that happened, but both of them centered the nation's attention on education and said there's something definitely wrong here, and we've got to redo it. We've got to go back to the basics in order to, ad fontes, if you want to use the Latin expression used in the Renaissance, we've got to go back to the sources in order to make schools what they were meant to be. And so that's been my goal for a long time. And what I find is that I'm not just an antiquarian and I'm not just an historically minded person. I've talked to congressmen, I've talked to major employers, I've talked to parents who themselves work in the tech industry. I've talked to all kinds of folks who are very often forward thinking and forward looking, but at the same time say, even in order to do technology right, we have to go back to the basics of education. And so the more I hear that and the more I see that, the more inspired I become. And to see classical education take off as it has in the last 20 years, I think tells us that there's some things that are just simply true and that are eternal. And if we don't focus our children's minds and hearts on those true and eternal goods, then we're shortchanging them. And that's a problem, because what we want is the best for our children.
Something else I'd like to add to that
Would
as
you? Oh,
well.
sorry. Would you like me to go through the history curriculum? I'm sorry. I think you implied that,
Sure,
which I can do briefly if you'd like me to.
sure. Yeah, that'd be
Well,
great.
again, this what I would call an American classical education is very much on the minds of the architects, of which I am one, of this curriculum. And if you look at the K through 8, the core knowledge, which is largely what the curriculum is. And I do need to point out Hirsch. Okay, well, I had a couple of books here written by Hirsch. And now, so E.D. Hirsch, who is responsible for the core knowledge curriculum, first wrote a book called Cultural Literacy, in which he basically said, in order to thrive in society, there's a certain implied knowledge that people need to have, and he called it cultural literacy. Over the course of his career, increasingly, he became committed to the idea of, really, this is an American phenomenon, and we need to give young people what they need, not only to be able to get a job, but actually to be good American citizens. And so books like The Making of Americans are what Hirsch has written a lot on, and this goes hand in hand with his core knowledge curriculum. And what I like about the core knowledge curriculum is that there is some aspect of American history taught every year, starting with kindergarten all the way up through 8th grade. And that is not true of all classical curricula. And in fact, sometimes the Americans are kind of put off and made into the modern realm, and you might skip a couple of grades without getting them. Whereas in the core knowledge curriculum, at every given point, especially K through 6, there's some aspect of American history being taught. So in the first grade, they study the American Revolution for the first time. In the second grade, they will study the Constitution, westward expansion, the Civil War. In the third grade, they'll go back to colonial foundations. In the fourth grade, they'll study the American Revolution again. Why? Well, this is the thing that educators call spiraling, but they'll be at a higher level and able to understand. They will have some facts coming into the class. Those facts will be reinforced as they study the American Revolution, which will prepare them for later study when they get up in middle school and high school. And so again, in the fifth grade, they will study westward expansion and the Civil War again, and then it keeps going up. Eventually, in the high school, which is not the Hirsch curriculum, but the curriculum that I largely wrote, they will study American history for 3 semesters at the high school level. In the 11th grade, as it's typically studied, the difference is cramming all of American history into 1 year is hard. So instead, it then moves into the first semester of the senior year so that you can do justice to the primary events that we want them to study. The American colonial foundations, of course, but the American Revolution, the Civil War and its meaning for our country, and then more into the 20th century with our place in the world through the world wars and the Cold War, as well as the civil rights movement, and really finally cashing that check that Dr. Martin Luther King talked about, so that we give liberty to all, which is the original promise. So that's just the American history. We could talk about the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the ancients, of course, Greece and Rome that they study. It's very robust, but always with a view to making American citizens, which is what really emanates from this curriculum. In addition, in the high school, they're going to have government. As you suggested, in the 8th grade, for about a quarter, they're going to study the Constitution, exclusively with their mind set on that, which is very unique. That doesn't happen in most schools. And in addition, a class that they really need to understand government and even economics is, and this isn't directly American, but moral philosophy, where a good semester is spent on all of these ideas of character that we've been building from the beginning, but understanding the why and the philosophy behind what goes into making a good man or woman, a good human being. And that becomes the moral philosophy course, which, by the way, that was what we would call the capstone course, the most essential course way back in the 18th century that Witherspoon imported to America through Princeton. Of course, they got it, like many good things, from the Scottish, but brought in moral philosophy as being that discipline which shapes our mind's understanding of the heart so that we can be good men and women. So there you go.
Yeah, and I'd like to also make the point too that something unique about this education, this curriculum, is that the kids learn from the actual source documents. They're not just reading a summary of what, you know, someone's interpretation of what the Constitution says. They're actually reading the Constitution, reading the Federalist Papers, you know, things like that. So it's, again, a very, very in-depth, and same with a lot of the great books that they're reading. They're reading the actual book. They're not reading you know, the Cliff's Notes version of it. Let's see here. A whole bunch of questions here. Having experience setting up many classical education academies, do you have any advice for those of us who will be speaking before the state board that would help us to be persuasive in terms of convincing them to approve the opening of a classical education academy in their county?
That is a good question. First of all, I think school boards that I've seen, both at the local and the state level, are most impressed when you have numbers. And so getting as many people into the room as you can is an essential, because you want to show that this is a school that's going to be able to move into a building and pay its bills, and that there's enough of a demand there. So the first thing is just simply a presence. There are many other things that I think you would want to address, but a lot of the questions will come up might be in the form of, well, will this school speak to the state standards? And don't you know that with this very different curriculum, you're still going to have to do the state test, et cetera. And so to be able to say yes, and in fact, this education is thriving in many states, though newer in Tennessee. But what usually happens is that when we bring this curriculum into a state, those students do better on the state mandated test than they would otherwise, even though we're not teaching to the test. And so I think, again, when you're really a pioneer in bringing these schools into a state that has not had a lot of this before, you're having to make a claim that you might not can prove, but the more evidence you have of other states having done well with this, then the more it shows. And so in the case, as you referred to before, what happened in Colorado, we didn't study for the state test at all, but we knocked it out of the park every time it came to the state test, which is why we had these very high ratings. Now, I will say that was in the pre-Common Core era, and it was before a lot of the tests had been changed in ways that are somewhat unpredictable. And so you just have to say, we're gonna go with the flow, and we will address the test at the same time that we have this curriculum here that is what we stand by. That I think would be one of the big questions. I think another of the big questions would be, well, is this really a school for everybody? Or isn't this classical stuff just elitist? You won't always get that question, but you do a lot. And what I would say to that is emphatically, yes, this curriculum is for everybody. And that's precisely why we're trying to do it in the charter school realm and not in a private school, in which it's really only those who can afford it who get to go there. And in particular, and this comes from the original founder of the school that I did run in Colorado, um, there there is a lot of attention given to special education, and this is very compatible with students who have higher needs, especially since 85–90% of those students struggle with language foremost. And so our explicit phonics program is the best thing that you can give to a child who is struggling with the language. In fact, in a lot of school districts, the only time a child would ever see phonics would be if the child had a reading difficulty. And so we're upfront about it, and that gives all students an advantage, but particularly those who might have some deficiencies in the English language and reading. So that would be one thing. And then the other thing would be, well, this sounds very patriotic. Is this just for a certain political party or a certain political stance? And again, I would say no. We don't advocate any partisan agenda whatsoever. And when it comes to really the controversial events in American history, notwithstanding, and we could discuss this as well, but say the Civil War. But when it gets really nasty in the 20th century, we only go up to about 1990. We don't discuss modern political events that then get debated with, the parents' own political slogans. We're not into that. We're trying to understand our foundations so that they can become intelligent citizens in their own right and not to just throw slogans back and forth. So we don't describe this as a conservative education. We would call it a traditional education. And if you're going to do a traditional education properly, when it comes to economics, for example, as happened to me when I went off to college, first book you read is Adam Smith, but then you follow up with Karl Marx. And then you have that debate that you wanted to have, right? What's weird is in our schools nowadays is the students will not even have read Karl Marx. And yet, perhaps not everywhere, but sometimes these Marxist little agendas are being imported into their little minds, but they haven't actually read the source. That's not right. Let's read all the books and then come up and see what the American and world experience has shown us about these ideas and what happens when they get into practice. And then let's have a discussion. To me, that seems very open. And we tell the teachers, you're not here to spout off on your political opinions. You're here to teach what our tradition tells us, and here's the past. And there have been a lot of arguments in the past. Hamilton and Jefferson didn't get along always, as we know. So let's explore that. By the way, nobody could have predicted that Hamilton would be as famous nowadays. I was a Hamiltonian long before it was cool to be so. So, like Barb Mandrell's great, I was country before country was cool. I like to say I was classical before classical was cool, and that included the complete works of Hamilton that I'm still working through.
Nice.
I hope somebody laughed at that at least a little bit. It's it's a lame classical joke, but it's something.
I guess I can take this question. So how separated are you from federal guidelines? Example, can they come in and say you have to teach a certain curriculum, i.e. health class, CRT, et cetera, or do they mandate COVID vaccines for kids? Actually, I wish Mike was on. Mike Terry is the superintendent for Founders Classical Academy, and some of these questions are better suited for him, or some of these answers are better coming from him. I can say that we don't specifically teach CRT. I guess they can certainly try to mandate things, but so far that has not been an issue for us, and we try to be as transparent as possible. There is in fact, there should be attached to the link for this webinar a brochure on Founders for those of you who aren't as familiar with it. And on that brochure is a QR code that takes you to the actual program guide and tells you every piece of literature that the kids are reading and what's being studied from K through 12th grade. And so certainly if anything, like that comes up, we certainly we'll let the parents know about it. There was no mandate for vaccines. One of the good things about being a charter school and being able to operate independently is that we didn't have to mandate that. In fact, Orange County Classical Academy, which uses this same program and curriculum out in Orange County, California, was actually able to open and have in-person instruction during COVID when all of the other California public schools were shut down. So we get a fair amount of latitude in being able to run things the way we deem appropriate. So let's see. All right. The next question here is, does this type of education promote entrepreneurship? I'm concerned with education only teaching people how to become employees. As you know, the World Economic Forum is extremely involved in education standards. Um, I'll say that we are actually going to be utilizing Dave Ramsey's curriculum in our schools, both the personal finance curriculum, and he's got an entrepreneurship program that's available. I believe it starts in the 6th grade. And we're going to be implementing that in our schools. Dr. Moore, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, these schools themselves are an exercise in entrepreneurship. So if you want to see an entrepreneurial school, the thing you probably want to do is come to a startup charter school. And as I would assume with any entrepreneurial endeavor, it's not going to be perfect from the very first moment. But actually, to be a pioneer and to be a founder is a great experience in young people's lives that really they'll carry with them for a long time. And one thing that I've done, for example, in the schools that I've helped start, is to spend a lot of time with the students and helping them develop their own self-government and student government, for example. So a lot of times, and I don't know if this will be the case with these schools, it's something to talk about, but a lot of times I've had parents prior to the opening of the school asking, what's the mascot? What's the mascot? And I'll say, we haven't decided yet. And they'll say, well, how can you have a school without a mascot? And I say, what we need to do is get the students to have a discussion about having a mascot, perhaps set up a student government that can run that as an orderly campaign and show them a measure of self-government that most kids in school never get because your mascot's just handed to you, right? And having been able to do that in setting up a student government and what constitutes eligibility and what the Constitution is going to look like, choosing a mascot, having the first student government, having the first dance at a school and how that's going to be run, are just great pioneering experiences that most kids don't get these days because it's just all handed to them. So I think, especially in the early years, it's not, you get these traditions and you learn the value of tradition, but especially in those first 2 or 3 years, there's so much to be gained from the students seeing this that we would hope that would lead to an entrepreneurial spirit in their own lives when they're starting up their own medical practices, their own dental practices, their own businesses, or what have you, and really understand what it means to be a pioneer.
Okay, that looks like that was the last question we had. Anybody have any other questions? Well, seeing none, Dr. Moore, you got anything you would like to say in closing?
Well, not specifically. It was great to talk to you all, although in this particular forum I didn't get to see any folks. So, but I've talked to a lot of folks about this before, and what I will say is that the families that I've seen who have had this kind of education for their children, as well as the children themselves, from the little bitty kids all the way up to the graduating seniors, they really appreciate it. and they see what an influence that education can be in their lives. And the more that you teach them, as I was just suggesting, the more they become a part of the experience and investing in it and making it what it ought to be. And it's just it is a very good thing to see in young people.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Moore, for taking the time out and speaking to everybody. The comments that I've gotten on there, everybody's very appreciative of it. Thank you all to the attendees for joining us and signing up, and we hope that y'all will be able to make it out. As Dr. Moore said in response to one of those questions, that the more people that we have come out and show interest in this school, the more likely we are to have the state commission overturn us or overturn the rejection from Williamson County and Sumner, and get a school like this going. And our plan is to get many of these schools going there. Our goal is to make this kind of education available to everyone who desires it. So anyway, with that, I thank you all. You all have a wonderful evening, and hopefully we'll see lots of you on the 20th and 21st.
Bye bye. Adios.